Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is returning guest King Crocoduck. In this conversation, we talk at length about his position on the justification for Israel's actions and its legitimacy as a state. And he allows me to ask him some hard questions, or what some people would consider hard questions about Israel. If you are interested in more Crocoduck, links to his work are down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel if you so desire to support it. Without further ado, here is King Crocoduck. The King.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing, man?
Also good. It's been a while, huh?
Has it? Yes, maybe 1 year, maybe two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
beard's a little whiter than I remember.
Oh no, it keeps on happening. Do you? Oh yeah, alligators don't grow beards.
Nah.
You guys have feathers sometimes?
I'm not out of my 20s yet, so it's a little early.
You fucking liar.
That's true.
Wait, you started doing videos when you're like a little teenager?
Yeah, 17.
Oh wow. Okay. That explains your pluck and confidence. You've been grounded down to a humble lump by life.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt it happening. Same as everyone else, I suppose.
Good. I'm glad for you. So, you know what I notice about the Jews?
What do you notice about the Jews?
Well, that you're not supposed to notice things about the Jews. I'm kidding. I don't know. It's such a sensitive topic. I tweeted something because there was this pager attack.
Hmm.
And what I saw on my timeline were a bunch of people celebrating this. And I'm like, should we wire our pleasure circuits to, this novel form of warfare? And I'm just kind of queasy about like the progression of technological warfare because, these thermite drones and these exploding phones. And I know we can get into if it's an explosion or not, or if the
Sure.
technology exists for my phone to be targeted, but it's on the menu now. And I'm just wary of that. But because it has something to do with Israel, I get a lot of pushback. Like if it was something about, something else.
I think maybe it's because it's about Hezbollah that you might be getting some pushback.
Mm,
I think people are not terribly allergic to the idea of terrorists getting their balls blown off. But,
hmm
if a person comes into this thinking like there's some code that the government can send to your phone that causes it to blow up, and Israel maybe makes that technology available to the government or whatever, I can understand some apprehension there. But
hmm
honestly, I think the capability to do what they did to, sneak some people into a supply chain and have them embed explosives into, a shell company. From what I heard, Israel made like three different shell companies in the
Yeah.
hopes that Hezbollah would eventually purchase pagers from them, and they embedded these with explosives. Um, at least that's what I'm hearing right now. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe in a few years we'll hear a different story. But
Yeah.
um, I feel like what was especially impressive about this, at least for me, is they got Hezbollah to pay for the pleasure of getting blown up. They have to
Yeah.
actually buy these phones or these whatever it
Devices.
was that
Yeah.
blew up. And yeah,
Yep.
pagers. I'm a little young for that.
How are you?
I mean, I go to Chili's and man, imagine being part of Hezbollah. You go to Chili's and they give you a pager. You just get PTSD flashbacks after that.
Yeah. Yeah. The wounds, the
Uh-huh.
war. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Your order is ready, sir. Oh, keep that away from me.
Yeah. There's So I had Jay Shapiro on, and that's when you reached out to me to kind of give a counter to him. Jay, I think would be fair to say, is skeptic of Israel's counteroffensive or offensive on Gaza, and he's really worried about the humanitarian issues involved. And there's other sides of the story, and I don't know where your position is. I'm assuming I've seen that you're pretty strong Israel and its right to defend itself. So I want to get into that and understand
Sure.
why it's such a captivating narrative and why it's so important to this country, to America, why
Sure.
Israel's so important.
Sure. And in fact, going back to Jay Shapiro real quick, I'd go farther. I'd say that he's skeptical of the legitimacy of national identities uh, and the way in which they distract the proletariat from uniting and engaging in class warfare against the real oppressors.
he we didn't get into his points of view, but he did definitely drop communist or socialist sympathies, and
Yeah,
it does
no,
seem
I
like
could I could predict every word that was about to come out of his mouth. I've talked to 1,000 people like this. I mean, it's the same song and dance as always. Um, and what's especially pernicious about its application in this context is it's not going to be restricted to Israel, which is why it should matter to America, in my opinion.
hmm,
Every step that's going to be taken to delegitimize Israel, you have to understand it in the context of case law. Uh, a judgment is passed in court, and now it's a precedent. Now it's something that can be used in future arguments and future resolutions. And the abolition of Israel's legitimacy as a nation state, whatever instruments are used to accomplish this, are the same instruments that they aim to use against all of the other nations, America included.
hmm. And where does that legitimacy derive from, in your opinion?
I think the legitimacy of the Jews to have a nation state in their homeland is the same as every other nation's right to have sovereignty in their national homeland.
Hmm. And so, how comfortably are you with investigating or just exploring briefly or whatever the origins of modern Israel post World War II, or I guess in the late 19th century, when it became
Extremely.
a project? Like it became a
Yes.
project, and I don't know much about it, but I do know that it was a project from European Jews, right?
Among others.
Yeah.
It just so happens that I recently binge listened to a podcast recommended by some people on your channel. This is Daryl Cooper of the Martyr Maid.
I just started that myself. I'm one episode in. What are your thoughts?
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts. In fact, I kind of prepared the bulk of my notes just based on everything that I heard from this podcast. So, starting with the positives, Daryl Cooper has a lot going for him in terms of how he understands and communicates history. He obviously has a deep passion for World War I and a very deep understanding of it, which makes sense given his obvious interest in how societal dynamics change in response to modernization. And
Mm,
of course, the whole story of World War I is how empires began dissolving into nation states.
hmm, hmm,
His Shop Talk episode, that one, I especially recommend. It's an episode kind of between episodes
hmm,
on the differences between tribal and national societies, with all the nuances of how institutional interactions displace traditional modes of existence as the state apparatus replaces the family as a means of interfacing with the various facets of our existence.
hmm,
That episode was a standout for me personally in terms of its clarity and breadth. And, another very powerful strength of his is he has the ability to command pathos with his anecdotes of individual actors.
hmm,
So later on in the series, you're going to hear about the legend of this guy named Faisal, who abides by traditional Arab hosting customs and honorably keeps enemy generals safe in his land, despite the fact that there would be tremendous military advantage to slitting their throats as they're sleeping. And it's because he's such an honest and honorable man. And there's a kind of uh, romantic character to traditional tribal society that Daryl
hmm,
Cooper emphasizes was lost in the wake of modernity.
hmm,
His description in the first episode at the start of what it would have been like to be a Jew in an Eastern European pogrom or
hmm,
an Arab during the famine and going to bed, having to listen to the moans of starving people in the street outside your window. It has a way of immediately placing the listener in a trance-like state. You kind of hover in a space between life and death as you contemplate existence from the point of
hmm,
view of people who had, only moments before Cooper begins speaking, been nothing more than a distant historical abstraction.
hmm.
That's very powerful. So, altogether, he distills this fantastic vintage of historical narrative and deep sociological musing, a new and exciting wine for those of us who are curious about the past.
Hmm.
And he proceeds to pour it all into the old wineskin of traditional Palestinian historiography. And the result is predictable and tragic. The wineskin splits. And that's the underlying theme of my thoughts on his his narration of this history.
What do you mean, traditional Palestinian historiography?
Well, consider the word historiography. We all know that history is not a list of events that happened and the order in which they happened. That's just chronology. History is the narrative you create by considering a representative subset of the evidence pertaining to those events
Yeah.
and inferring causal relations between those events to tell a story about what happened. And because of the politically fraught nature of such an enterprise, it's possible to tell a multitude of competing stories that each reflect the political agendas of whoever tells the story.
Hmm.
So, from the point of view of a cynical postmodernist, for example, not saying he is one, but from their point of view, of course, the story that wins out is just going to be a reflection of whoever has the power to enforce their story. And to an optimistic empiricist, on the other hand, there exist objective standards that all parties can agree to in the course of adjudicating competing narratives.
Hmm.
And to some degree, both perspectives are valid, and we can talk more about that in detail. But to answer your question, what's important to consider is the the historiographic landscape of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The historiography that Cooper presents reflects the Palestinian point of view. And to be clear, not a Palestinian point of view, but the Palestinian point of view. You see, in contrast to Western, including Israeli historiographies, which are distinguished by their pluralism, the Palestinian historiography is characterized by its rigidity and stagnancy. This is as true for historians living in Palestine as it is for those who are living in its diaspora, like Rashid Khalidi or Elan Pape. In an insular totalitarian society like Palestine, or really almost anywhere in the Arab world, deviation from orthodoxy, like questioning the basic assumptions of Palestinian historiography, such as the idea that the Zionists were a colonial enterprise, or that the conflict originated with the Balfour Declaration, and that before that Jews and Arabs were living together in peace, holding hands, and all the rest of it. You run the risk of coming home if you're not abiding by orthodoxy and finding your apartment smashed up, or perhaps even a knife in your back.
Hmm.
If you're living in New York City and you've got people in Nablus or East Jerusalem, you need to be equally careful about what you write down in your books, lest you receive a phone call saying that members of your family have been stabbed in the streets of Ramallah on suspicion of being Zionist collaborators.
Hmm.
In contrast, Western historiographies, which encompass views ranging from pro-Palestinian settler colonial narratives to pro-Zionist tales of treacle heroism, these are more dynamic and varied. You run the race, excuse me, you run the risk of being called a racist apologist for violence of some stripe or another. It's pretty much inevitable when discussing this conflict.
Yeah.
But you at least have the benefit of cognitive flexibility and creative energy of the sort that's pretty much absent from Palestinian historiography. And that means that when new information challenges Western narratives, they have the benefit of being able to adapt and revise, becoming stronger than before. But the Palestinian narrative, being mired in harshly enforced orthodoxy, suffers from the limitations of a stagnant narrative. It can't adapt, it can't respond effectively to facts that challenge its basic assumptions. And this, I think, is the trap that Cooper falls into. By adopting the standard Palestinian assumptions and narrative, he unwittingly inherits all of its defects, which even his immersive style and sociological depth can't fix.
What's one vector of a mistake or a mistaken frame?
Well, one of the more jarring junctures where the wineskin splits is at the subject of Palestinian national identity. He tells us in the first episode that Zionists came in with the presumptuous colonial assumption that the Palestinian Arabs were ethnically undifferentiated from the other Arabs, which, in conjunction with actual untrue things that they did say, like hardly anyone lived in the land, the suggestion is that this assumption was wrong. And yet, when he later delves into the differences between the social dynamics of tribal societies and societies with strong state institutions, again, probably the strongest episode in the entire series, he lends support to the claim that the Palestinian national identity did not exist until after the Zionists arrived. Indeed, he goes on later to talk about their national aspirations to join Greater Syria, as well as the notable Nashashibi clan's attempts to absorb the region into Jordanian territory. There
Hmm.
are all these different tribes, and some of them are more notable families than others. They command more prestige and more attention from the local Arabs, and the Nashashibi is one of them. For my own money, I know of the San Remo Conference, which held a vote in 1920, and that reflected one widely held view that Palestinian Arabs should be absorbed into Syria. And you don't have a Palestinian national identity if you're trying to get absorbed into Jordan or trying to get absorbed into Syria. And even though some people, particularly those engaged in organized insurgencies against both Jews and Brits, may have been thinking along the lines of Palestinian national identity, there's no good reason to believe that such views were actually widespread among the Arabs.
Hmm.
So, in this instance, Cooper is oscillating between critiquing Zionist assumptions and agreeing with them. He wants to condemn them for failing to acknowledge the national characteristics of the people they're ostensibly colonizing, yet he also wants to explore the sociological dynamics of the pre-national identity of these people when explaining their failure to develop state institutions during the Mandate period, which is one essential area where the Jews were immensely successful.
Well,
So Cooper's, storytelling, vivid and immersive as it is, nevertheless bursts open when confronted with the contradictory realities of Palestinian national identity. By trying to contain this complex, evolving identity within the rigid framework of Palestinian historiography, which insists upon a colonial relation between Zionists and Arabs, the narrative structure collapses under the pressure of its own contradictions.
Well, isn't part of the strength of colonialism and why it took the world by storm is that the peoples who were colonized, or the lands that were colonized by the European powers, let's just say, we're not thinking in the terms. We're thinking they had a different way of conceptualizing intertribal dynamics and land dynamics, and how all this stuff fits together with a more traditionalist or pre-nationalist framework. And then when coming into contact with nationalism, eventually, inevitably adopt that framework and then have to catch up. So could it be the case that the land of Palestine was inhabited by a people that had centuries of organically constructed ways of dealing with one another, adjudicating, conflicts and economic pacts and so on and so forth. But then when introduced with a westernized colonialist way of viewing the world, or the Israelis declaring that they are a nation in this land, they had to then catch up to that way of thinking and then adopt nationalism. And so they didn't have nationalism before that, but they still had an effective people and land.
There is
that
truth
was
to what you're
inextricable.
saying. There is
Yeah.
truth to this.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that often gets lost in this entire discussion is that it is true that there was a colonial presence in the southern Levant at this time, but that colonial presence, contrary to the Palestinian historiography, was exclusively of a British character. The Zionists, the Jews, were not part of a colonial enterprise.
Well, what do you mean by colonial? If they didn't, if you leave your house for several generations and then come back and say it's your house and you are different and the people who live there are different, it's not necessarily colonialism that you're trying to reclaim your house or try to fit yourself back into that particular place, but you are an outsider coming in. So the British coming in as colonizers had a different mandate and desire and intention with being there than Israelis or the Jews when they went to Israel, right? So even though like the British were colonizers, I want to break apart what we mean by colonizer so we can define more
Yeah,
nuancedly what the Israeli project has
sure.
been.
Sure. So, the question is in what sense did the Zionists supposedly enact colonialism? And, last I checked, colonialism is when your society takes control of another society for the purpose of plundering its resources and
Yeah.
enriching
Or
the motherland.
organizing it and then benefiting from that organization. I mean, it doesn't have to be complete exploitation. Like there can be trade-offs.
Well,
But maybe I'm wrong or evil or Western to
I
think
mean,
that.
the entire point of a colonial enterprise, though, is to extract stuff from this colonial outpost and siphon away resources and other benefits to your motherland, to your society. So Britain builds a pipeline from Mosul in Iraq to Haifa in Mandatory Palestine. It does this for the purpose of controlling the region's oil and enriching the motherland. That's
Yes.
textbook colonialism.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
France takes over Morocco, uproots its male population to serve as cannon fodder for the glory of the motherland in the First World War. Again, textbook. But what are the Jews doing? And, throughout the podcast, Cooper uses phrases like the Zionists were freaking everyone out, kicking down doors and making a big mess, or the Zionists were colonizing the region. But what was the actual reality on the ground? What happens when we replace these meaningless euphemisms? Honestly, I have no idea what doors the Zionists kept kicking down, but I'm sure the carpenters in the region were very happy with all the business the Jews must have been
Good one.
bringing them, what with all these broken doors lying everywhere. Certainly, the carpenters in the 20th century must have had better relations with the Jews than a certain notable member of their trade did in the first. But I'm getting sidetracked. The point is, when we cut the BS and stop using euphemisms, the complaint comes down to the fact that the Jews were moving in and buying private property from local Arabs. They were refusing to abide by the jizya and the zimmihood that the Arabs had grown so accustomed to over the
What
centuries.
are those two terms? Could you enlighten
Jizya
me?
and zimmi. So jizya is the tax that they imposed onto quote unquote people of the book. These are Jews and Christians.
Okay.
Think of it as you own a business downtown and a guy comes up to you and offers you protection. I'm gonna collect some money from you in exchange for protection. You
Yeah.
ask him, what are you protecting me from? And the answer, of course, is me. That's the jizya.
Yeah.
It's an extortionate tax.
Okay.
And zimi is the status. It's the religiously enforced status of second-class citizens in Islamic countries. So, you have to be deferential to Muslims on the street. You have to publicly identify yourself and wear certain clothes. There are certain institutions you don't have access to. There are limitations to what you're allowed to say and do. And, if you ever wondered where Hitler got the idea to identify Jews, force them to identify themselves by wearing stars on their clothes, look no further. That started with Islamic empires. They did that as part of the Zimi program. And the Jews who were coming in at this time, these were not Jews who had been living in the Middle East for centuries and centuries. Not for the most part. There actually was a large contingent of Jews from Yemen who had been kicked out of Yemen, and they made their way to Palestine. But the Zionist program was specifically geared towards European Jews, and these Jews had picked up the habits of modernity and the appetites of enlightenment, which had all these radical ideas like equality under the law, things that ran into contradiction with the sensibilities of the highly conservative local Muslim population. So the Jews were not exploiting the labor or the resources of the locals. They were moving in and buying private property, and they were exercising the same property rights that everyone else in the region enjoyed. If colonization means de facto overthrowing Islamic traditions of zimihood and jizya and replacing them with Western norms of equality under the law, then sure, colonization proceeded in earnest. By this logic, the American South was colonized by the Yankees when they came in and forced a change in the labor laws.
Yeah.
Certainly that's how the KKK saw it when they subsequently went around butchering any uppity blacks who were exercising their newfound rights. That's how the local Arabs saw it when they also went around killing westernized Jews who had the temerity not to bow to their Muslim masters when they passed them in the streets.
But
So,
isn't such a conflict inevitable? I mean, if you move into a place en masse as an ethnic group or as a different group, there's going to be conflict. And also, if you're going to import Western ideals into a decidedly non-Western territory, there's going to be conflict. And I'm not excusing the conflict. I'm just
Right.
saying it's inevitable.
Yeah.
However
Yeah.
we dress it up, it's going to happen. So how does it how is it navigated without
Yeah.
internecine conflict, which is how it has been navigated? And I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying
I
that's
get you. I
what
get
keeps
you.
on happening.
So when the Zionists first started coming in, you have to understand these were idealists. These were people, a lot of them very strongly on the left and very strongly opposed to colonialism.
Hmm.
And their idea, you can read this in Theodor Herzl's Judenstaat. This was the guy who invented Zionism. His idea was you were going to develop economic incentives. You're going to, procure jobs for the local Arabs outside of the territory that's going to subsequently become the state. And in this way, you end up creating the demographic conditions that will support a Jewish state, where you can have a democratic majority that you can be assured will not vote for the second-class citizenship of Jews.
Yeah. Well, but also vote probably for the first class citizenship of Jews. I mean, how do you prevent it from going the other way? Like a Jewish supremacist society, if you're looking for a Jewish majority, can you trust just human psychology? I'm not saying the Jews are
You
particularly,
can
you know,
you can trust the ideals of the Enlightenment and the commitment of the political program to those ideals. Um, if you read the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it guarantees equal protection under the law for all non-Jewish citizens. To this day, there are still Arab Muslim and Arab Christian and other minority groups like the Druze. They all enjoy the exact same rights as the Jews who are living there. In fact, they also have the privilege of not having to serve in the Israeli military. That's forced upon every Jew living in the country. But despite this, a lot of Bedouins, a lot of Druze, a lot of Arab Muslims, a lot of Arab Christians, they still voluntarily enlist because they are Israeli nationalists as well.
okay. And do they, so, I mean, I don't know. This is a really complex question. I don't know if you can know this or if you do know this, but Jews having more responsibility militarily for their country, doesn't that give them at least an attitude of being more important or more central to Israel than these other groups? I mean, can you completely mitigate, classism spreading along ethnic lines if
I
you
mean,
create something that's based on ethnic solidarity?
I mean, you could ask a similar question, I think, of white Americans having the majority of the share of the military power, as well as all kinds of. I mean, it fundamentally it comes down to the letter of the
Yeah.
law. You can have societal discrimination. You can have instances where people are being assholes, but fundamentally the letter of the law is what it is, and this is all that liberalism promises. Um, if additional actors come, as they often do, and start demanding equity, that's a whole other story.
But for the most part, from your point of view, is it okay for me to say Zionist project? There's so many landmines where people think I'm saying something or regurgitating some sort
That's
of
fine.
propaganda.
Zionist project.
It's just the project of creating an Israeli state. It's called Zionism because of a hill. But from your point of view, has Zionism held to these enlightened ideals in the face of the pressures that Israel has faced?
I think if you evaluate it holistically, the answer is yes. If you look at isolated instances, I mean, you can talk about the failures of liberalism in isolated instances in American history as well. I forget
Yeah.
the name of that prison, Abu Ghraib.
Yeah.
You know the one I'm talking about,
Yeah, it wasn't in
right?
America, just if
Yeah,
anybody's listening.
but it was done by Americans,
Yes.
supposedly fighting for, liberal Enlightenment principles,
Yeah.
right?
Exporting democracy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There are bad actors, and at times there are even institutions that behave poorly. Um, Fundamentally, I think the ethos of the nation has to be considered holistically instead of in terms of
Yeah.
the worst moments of its history.
Yeah, it's just, you bring up the word ethos, and I am fascinated by this because it's an ethnos and an ethos. And I wonder if Israel, modern day Israel, can be an example of the not just the validity, but the durability of Enlightenment ideals as applied to human beings. Because some critics of the Enlightenment continually harp that it's not conducive for actual human behavior. But if we look at Israel as a test case of trying to, from scratch, implement these ideals and impose these ideals on a piece of land, kind of out of nowhere, just kind of plonk it down, see how it works. What does it show us about the durability, the validity of various Enlightenment ideals?
I think it shows that when Enlightenment ideals are challenged by people who are prepared to engage in a contest of arms to overthrow those ideals,
Okay.
that the Enlightenment ideals can and will militarily prevail. That is the paradox of toleration, and the solution to the paradox of toleration has always been the application of force, military force, if necessary, in order to create the conditions under which something like Enlightenment values is capable of existing.
That's just such a squared circle. It's like we're going to provide you liberty at the point of a gun. It's just like you can't completely just wash away strength and power from this attempt to give people liberty.
You cannot, and I don't think liberalism pretends to. I think that once you acknowledge the existence of the law, once you outsource the right to engage in violence to the state, you have already made the concession that disputes are not going to be adjudicated by you personally. You have a disagreement with your neighbor, or your neighbor does something bad to you. You don't have the right to engage in reprisal. You have to interface with state institutions that will do that in the way that they see fit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is a point of view that was developed at a certain point in history by certain people, right?
Yes.
Developed and then implemented.
Yes, this
Can
is
it
not
be
universal.
No, it's not universal. Though it has airs of universalism sometimes in its implementation. But like it's the Scottish Enlightenment, it's the British Enlightenment, it's the European Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how European Jews adopted that. Or
This is an excellent question.
Yeah.
And the answer is European Jews adopted it because Europe adopted it. If you trace the history of Jewish national identity from ancient times to modern times, you'll find that that national identity has evolved, just like all national identities have evolved.
Yeah.
A British person living in 1500 CE is not the same as a British person living today. They have different conceptions of their national identity, and you can trace how that history, how that identity has changed over time, how it modernized. And the Jewish national identity has undergone multiple transformations. If you look at, like, for example, the history of how the Old Testament was written, it was originally written by polytheists. The people who compiled this document had what was called a monolatric relationship to the Abrahamic deity, to Yahweh. This was actually the Canaanite god of war. There were other gods as well, gods like Ashra, who was the goddess of fertility. And the Bible will even mention things like the temple priestesses, the temple whores, because over at the holiest place in the world right now, at the Temple Mount, back then they carried out ritualistic orgies in order to promote fertility and the harvest. Imagine that, having orgies suddenly results in a bunch of pregnancies because the gods are pleased. Who would have thought?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But over time, power has a way of consolidating, and there were a group of people, the Yahwists, who had an especially strong affinity to the god of war. And this isn't the first time we see something like this, right? At Athens had its patron goddess Athena. Sparta had Ares. Delphi had, what was it, Apollo? I don't remember off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. But you can imagine a coastal city would have been Poseidon, right? Everybody has their special god, and it just so happened that the group whose special god was the god of war also
The
happened to be the group
conquest.
that was best at conquering all the other groups and
Yeah.
forcing them to become monotheists, serving this one god of war.
Yeah. What do you? Well, so let's chart that. Like, how does the god of war become refined into the god of love? Or how does the national identity consolidating into monotheism eventually lead to liberalism and equality
Well,
under the law?
one fact that's often not appreciated, especially by people who will deny the national character of Jewishness, is that in ancient times, the national identity and the religious identity were so closely bound up with one another
Yeah.
that they couldn't be separated. There was no such thing as separation of synagogue and state back then.
Hmm.
It just wasn't part of their self-conception. But following the first exile at the hands of the Babylonians and their subsequent return to their homeland, they had developed the resources during their time in exile that was necessary for the preservation of a national identity, things that allowed them to symbolically differentiate themselves from other groups and as a result be able to hold on to this common sense of identity that bound everyone together.
Hmm.
And initially it's bound in, religious ritual, but you can think of it as
Yeah.
kind of having a very expensive price of admission that only members of your tribe are going to be willing to pay.
Are you talking
You
about a
know,
snippy snippy thing?
yeah, you want to join the club, you grab a knife and do the thing. And that's part of the reason why the number of Jews has always been so small. Muslims also circumcise, but they also engage in very aggressive what's the term I'm looking for? Let's call it advertisement of their religion, aggressive advertisement in the
Mm.
form of proselytizing and by the sword.
Yeah. What
Um,
makes Jews not inclined to proselytization? Like more just center facing and not necessarily needing to add more. Kind of agnostic to
that's an
evangelic
that's an interesting
evangelizing.
question. Um, I suspect that it had a lot to do with the Babylonian exile. I think the emphasis has always been on surviving and remembering who you are,
Hmm.
as opposed to convincing other people to become part of you.
To agree with you.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So it's more of an ontological rather than an epistemic thing. And I'm using big words, but it's more like a way of being rather than a way of thinking.
I think so. And also, Jews have a reputation for not being the most agreeable people. Um, you'll put three Jews in the room to
Yes.
study the Talmud, and you'll get four opinions because one of them
Yeah.
is going to have two contradictory opinions that he's going to throw around just for the purpose of challenging everybody. Which of
Yeah.
course is going to piss them off, but it creates a culture of scholarship. It creates a culture of literary theory and
Hmm.
contemplation that ultimately does good things for the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm between two Jews right now. Like you and Jay Shapiro are just kind of having a conversation through me, or I'm having a conversation through you. But you're both Jews and very attached to that way of being, but just have different opinions on the state or the nation of Israel. So.
Yes, yes. The post-Enlightenment Jew is the Jew who was there and following the developments of the Enlightenment, and who decided that the national characteristics of Judaism can and should be separated from the theological characteristics. And in this way, it was possible to speak sensibly of the atheist Jew, of the Jew who retained the national characteristics, but without retaining the metaphysical belief in miracles and things of that nature.
Why do you say national rather than ethnic? Is there a
Uh,
difference there?
I use the terms interchangeably
Okay,
when,
I just wanted to make sure.
yeah, and when I use a term like racial, I use this in reference to things like physiological characteristics, skin color, nose bridge,
Hmm.
hair texture, things like that. And when I use terms like national and ethnic, I'm referring to the character of a people who have voluntarily taken up solidarity with a certain set of symbols and practices.
Hmm. Hmm. I feel like we have a bunch of different things spinning right now. I don't want to go to a new question, but I was just thinking about how the Jewish nationality either like a figure like Ben Shapiro. He's very conservative, but the one question, and I don't know if this is a bad person talking point, but one question is he more loyal to Israel or to America? And I wonder if the Jewish national identity is in conflict with the American national identity, if you can serve two masters.
This is a very good question. And the answer is because the national identity is going to be a function of acts of the will, it's going to be a function of the values that you hold and the values that you support. It is possible, at least in principle, to separate your loyalty to the nation from your loyalty to the state. So, for example, if it turns out that Israel does something that is so egregious and disgusting to the sensibilities of Ben Shapiro that he feels it does not properly represent the ethos of the Jewish nation, then I can very easily see how he would support America in potentially overthrowing Israel and replacing it with, an American puppet regime or something of that nature.
Because in this hypothetical scenario, he wants his nation restored to his values.
Correct.
And so there has to be a state level change.
Yeah, the state is just that set of administrative and military apparatuses which at least nominally enforce the will of the nation.
Yeah. Okay. So there was this thread that I kind of just did a response video on. I don't know if I'm going to publish it or not, but James Lindsay made a thread about truth and error, and I think he's continuing to warn about the rise of the woke right, or some sort of anti-liberal influence from the right that could corrupt the conservative project. And when it comes down to it, it seems like he believes that the Constitution is the defining instance or document, but it's more than a document. Like, that's the truth of our nation is found in the Constitution. And I think that's interesting. There's a lot of things to say there, but what is the document upon which, and it's obvious question, but what is the document on which Jewish national identity is founded? And is it more robust than American identity, national identity? And what can one learn from the other? It seems like, I'm sure that Israel had a charter that was kind of modeled on the American Constitution because it was a modern state, right?
Yes.
But I'm wondering if there's something even more robust that informed something more than a constitution that causes that nation to form. And if our Constitution is necessarily the correct basis for nationhood to be established on.
Yeah, so this is a good question. The way I think of it is something like a constitution, a legal document like this.
Okay. Yeah.
It functions analogously to the way a user's manual functions for an operating system. If you want to run the American operating system, this is the user's manual. These are the parts that make up the America OS. Mm-hmm. And of course, because of the limitations inherent to language, there are parts that are deliberately vague and open to interpretation, and there are also things in there that are open to updates. You can update the software, and there are rules in place for how you can do that.
Yeah, but is that where the state and the nation intersect, or should that be where the state and the nation intersect? Like, that document is where.
I think the state and the nation intersect with more fundamental areas, the philosophies and the histories that have informed the construction and the interpretation of this document. So, extending the analogy a bit, let's say the software runs into an error because there is some vague line of code where it's not entirely sure how to correctly interpret it, so it doesn't know how to interpret a particular program. That's when you dispatch a special group of service engineers called the Supreme Court Justices who have access to the technical manual, not the user manual intended for the user, but the technical manual intended for the engineer, where they go through this technical manual, the Federalist Papers and case law and things like that, and they resolve the dispute according to their interpretation of these more fundamental texts. As well as some history, the history of the development, the patch notes from previous versions of the software.
Yeah. Would Congress be like the UI manager or something like that? I just want to fill out the metaphor.
Yeah, let's do that. So Congress Congress is what passes the legislation, and the legislation is like updates to the software or new programs that are. So you can
Okay.
think of Congress as like some program that writes other programs to allow the software to perform new functions.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the engineers see if that works or not.
Yeah, the engineers, they check and see, no, this update is broken, we're going to throw it out, or it needs such and such modification, or we interpret it to mean this thing, so we'll change, we'll clarify what this line of code means, and that's how the program is going to execute from now on.
Okay. And just one more thing, and then we can go on. What
Mhm.
is this executive branch? Is that the user?
A good question. Executive branch. Well, what is the executive branch? The executive branch runs a set of centralized administrations. Um, whatchamacallit, has the veto power and commands the military. So we can think of the executive branch as being perhaps a separate. I don't know. Maybe the people in the Commons can go crazy
Yeah.
up the engagement and fill out the metaphor
Please do.
there.
Please do. Yeah.
But I can see this working with some more brain power.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry to get us mired in that. It's just a
No, you're good.
fascinating thing. So, what legitimizes Israel as a nation? So there's the history
Mhm.
of the people,
Yeah.
and then there's this problematic thing that it's a place in time. It's a land that
Mhm.
has history attached to it, but the people have gone off and had a lot more history, and then bring back a new way of thinking to that land. And I don't know what they do there, but there's people living in that land already, and they have to make some sort of peace. And peace isn't happening for a variety of reasons we can get to. But what legitimizes Israel?
Well, there are a few things to take note of. First of all, at the time that the state of Israel is declared in 1948, there is no state in the region. There's private property, and there are private property owners. And the state of Israel makes clear that they maintain their property rights. You get the same right as an Arab as you would if you were a Jew. So, to extend the analogy to America, if I'm living in, I don't know, New York City, say, and I own private property there, the day before the Declaration of Independence, I have the property rights with respect to that, whatever cafe or business I own there, right?
Hmm.
The day after the Declaration is signed, I still maintain all of those rights. It just so happens that now I'm a citizen of this nation, regardless of whether I consented to, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. By not joining up with the loyalists, I have at least tacitly agreed that I'm going to be a member of the nation.
Hmm.
And it's more or less the same story. In 1948, when they signed their Declaration of Independence, if you're an Arab landowner, you still maintain your property rights. You don't de facto have to exit the nation just because you're Arab. Now, a war did immediately happen, and a lot of Arabs did join on the other side of the war. So they did become the quote unquote loyalists who subsequently had to be expelled. If you're going to try to throttle the new nation in its crib, then you don't get to keep your property rights.
Well,
But if
that's where
you,
the nation has to be imposed,
Mhm. Yeah,
which
this
it
is
has to legitimate itself through force.
yes, but before it does that, there are ideological justifications, and the ideological justifications are fundamentally no different from that of any other state.
Hmm.
If you accept the view that every nation, that is to say, the people who constitute this group of people, there's the people who constitute this group. If you accept that they have a right to a state, they have a right to that set of organizations, those apparatuses, which will nominally enforce their will within the territory that their national identity originated, then there's nothing exceptional about the case of Israel. The thing that you're bringing up with this long gap, it suggests that there was no connection to the land over the course of the second exile that lasted for 2,000 years. And that's not correct. There was still attachment to the land in both material and ideological terms.
Hmm.
So, beginning with the material terms, not all of the Jews ended up leaving the area during the second exile. There were Jews who remained, but they had to deal with very harsh and very difficult conditions that made it basically impossible for them to fend for themselves. Restrictions on employment, exorbitant and extortionate taxes in the form of the jizya, um, things like that, that would have forced them to either convert and effectively adopt a new national identity, assimilate into the identity of their conquerors, or end up leaving. And the way they were able to maintain a continuous presence, albeit as a minority, over the course of 2,000 years, is because Jews from around the world would constantly send money in order to maintain this Jewish presence in the homeland. So, and of course, that money gets spent in the local economy, and that contributes to the material development of the region. So that's the first sense in which Jews are always connected to the homeland, even if they're in exile. And the second one is ideologically they're committed to this homeland through their religion over the course of 2,000 years. So every day, 3 times a day, Jews would face in the direction of Jerusalem and ask God, begging him to let them return to their homeland. Jewish pilgrimages happened continuously over the course of those 2,000 years. Every year during the final night of the Seder, it was customary for Jews to say, "Next year in Jerusalem." And, all of the national holidays, all of the traditions, everything is centered around this particular location. It doesn't make sense. The guy who you had on, the Jay Shapiro guy, he was talking about a Judaism that was unconnected to that territory, that was unconnected from national identity. And this just doesn't make it doesn't make sense in the way that it makes sense for Christians. With Christians, it doesn't matter that Jesus is born in Bethlehem or that Paul has his revelation in Damascus. Because in the Christian theology, God is wherever you go. The God is not localized to the temple, as was the case with
Or
traditional
the
Jewish
ethnos.
Orthodox.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
there's a, yeah.
yeah, it's universal. Everybody can be Christian.
Yeah.
But with the Jewish religion, it's grafted onto the national identity. Or I should say, the national identity is contained within the religion. So I don't really understand what it would mean to be a Jew without also being a Jewish nationalist. Maybe not necessarily a Zionist. There are some Jews, they're an underwhelming minority, but there are some Jews who think that Israel should not be allowed to exist because they hold to a theology which says that a Jewish state cannot materialize until the coming of the until the coming of the Messiah. Again, they constitute an underwhelming minority. What happened was, after the second exile, the rabbis had to consolidate power in order to function as community leaders. And the way they did this was by saying that Jews will not return to the Holy Land until the coming of the Messiah. And in this way, the rabbis were able to maintain power over their communities in perpetuity.
And I guess that was adaptive for Jews. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speak of adaptations, why would Judaism go through certain evolutions that mirror the evolutions of modernity? How would Judaism incorporate Enlightenment ideals as an adaptation, but not shed its nationalism? Could nationalism be something that's shed?
No.
It's okay. So
No.
why is that so?
Because there is no liberalism without nationalism. As you indicated, liberalism, the Enlightenment values, they emerged in a specific place and time. And if you assent to the view that these particular values are superior to their antitheses, equality under the law is better than inequality under the law, for example, then you have by default indicated that the nations that have produced these values and which maintain these values are, in that sense, morally superior to the nations which don't.
Well, and then it bears its fruit out. I mean, to take kind of a Tucker, to quote Tucker, in his conversation with Daryl Cooper, if Churchill won the war, why when you go to Britain it's overrun and it doesn't seem British anymore? So if these liberal ideals were rested on nationalism, one wonders why the nation state is now being subsumed by the globalist game, like that high game. I don't know if you think of that as
Yeah,
a
because the
conspiracy
greatest
theory or not, but
the greatest strength of liberalism is also its greatest weakness, and that's its toleration. Toleration is what allows you to entertain ideas that could potentially be very good for your society, and it allows you to entertain ideas that could potentially also be very bad. And when bad actors exploit certain weaknesses and defects in the way your institutions are structured, this is not, in my opinion, so much a what's the term I'm looking for? An indictment of the quality of liberalism itself, as it is an indictment of the weaknesses of certain institutions in keeping bad actors and preventing the propagation of shit ideas. We have somewhere along the way lost the robustness that allows us to keep certain bad ideas out.
and where does that ability and robustness come from? Religious, an ethic, or
Well,
could it be an ethnos? I mean,
that's
some people on the right who are beyond the pale say that this is kind of an Anglo-Saxon way of thinking, and only Anglo-Saxons, and I guess Jews have been able to adopt this way of thinking, can actually implement this way of thinking. I don't ascribe to that, but there's that ethnic quandary that pops up there too.
racial. It the way they're characterizing it is in racial terms, but I characterize it in ethnic terms. This is something that has to be voluntarily adopted. And it is true that different racial groups can be shown to have different distributions of attitudes relative to other racial groups in relation to questions that are of interest to people who like liberalism. And I don't pretend to have an answer to that conundrum. I know that an answer exists because it worked for the Jews. The Jews went from this tribal, monarchical, theocratic national identity into a liberal, secular, and nationalistic identity. All national identities have had this exact transformation, in fact. I don't know if we have the ability to manufacture the circumstances that would change the environment in such a fashion that you can engineer people into adopting the presuppositions of liberalism. And I wouldn't attempt it either. I think every nation has to undergo its own course of development, and through international dialogue and through discussion. Potential. You can't bomb people into democracy, and you can't absorb them into your society and socialize them into it either. It's something that has to be naturally developed over the course of their history.
Yeah, generations. Yeah. So one thing that I woke up in the middle of the night and I was thinking through things, and one thing that I question is that, when I started off the conversation talking about, being wary about these pagers detonating, and then people like going after me because it's Israel and Hezbollah, and you made a point that's probably just because they're terrorists, but it seems like Jews foster and express defensiveness around their ethnic identity.
Yeah.
And there's reason for that, historical reason, with the pogroms, and negative reasons for that, but there's positive reasons for that. But they won't accept a program in America that tries to erode that identity. Whereas and this is a bad term, it already shows that it has eroded. With whites in America, we no longer have that identity. And furthermore, our identity is under constant assault, and that if you even mention the words white interest, you are automatically cast into the Hitlerian camp, right? So Jews are allowed, or not allowed is probably the wrong word, but just they cling to that and they exercise that freedom, whereas whites are denigrated. Why are whites not allowed to organize around their ethnicity? And what does that say about that?
The answer goes
and
back to the. The
is
answer
it
goes
good
back, the answer
that we're
goes
not
back to
allowed to
the
do that?
distinction. It goes back to the distinction between an ethnic identity and a racial identity. an ethnic identity is voluntary. It's something that you can adopt through acts of the will ideologically. Your
Is it
membership
though?
with
But that just doesn't sound totally true because it's cultivated over generations, and those generations don't consent when they're born to be born as Irish. They're born into Irishness, and then it's bred into them, and then they breed it into their children. So I don't know where
but
like
your
this
but your but your
volition comes
Irishness,
into account.
you can choose whether to remain Irish or whether you want to become something else over the course of your life. And
Okay.
somebody else can choose to become Irish or not to become Irish.
It just seems like the Jewish identity has formed a loop to constantly perpetuate itself very strongly and insularly in Jews. It's durable. It's incredibly durable, and other ethnic identities haven't been.
Well, if by ethnic identity we're including, whites and blacks, I don't believe that these are ethnic identities. I think they have the
Okay.
capacity to become them through conflict, and this is where the real danger lies.
Okay.
Uh, the Palestinian national identity formed through its conflict with the Jews, and that national identity is characterized fundamentally by jihad and
Yeah.
anti-Semitism.
And could it have happened some other way?
Yes.
That the conflict wasn't the seat of nationalism, and it wasn't the fault of nationalism and the bug of nationalism infecting a people who were not cultured to it to react negatively to it, and that something could have happened, education or other forms of manipulation. I'm not using that as a moral term, to avoid the outcome.
Yeah, I think we can speculate about alternative possible
Yeah,
histories that could
of
have
course.
happened if,
Yeah.
for example, the initial Jewish plan to create economic incentives for Arabs to migrate out of the region, and then the ones who stayed, you provide them a liberalizing education. Maybe it changes them, maybe it doesn't. In that case, eventually you have the development of something resembling a binational organization, something that allows a substantial, but perhaps even a majority Arab country that doesn't impose zimihood and the jizya onto the Jewish minority, right?
Yeah.
We can imagine something like that might have happened under a different set of circumstances,
Yeah.
but
Well, I mean, but human, do you think it's just indicative of what human beings are, or is there just a misstep somewhere in history
I
that
think
has
it's a
caused
combination
things
of
to be
both.
so violent?
I think it's a combination of both of these things.
Yeah.
I don't think you can point to any specific missed opportunity in history and say this is when there could have been peace. Actually, no, that's not a lie. Sorry, that's not true. You can point to points in history where they could have accepted a two-state solution, but in that case, you're not talking about a binational identity. In a two-state solution, one of these is going to be a liberal democracy, and the other one is going to be a theocratic dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the whole notion of a binational country doesn't even make sense unless
Yeah,
one is dominant and is
exactly.
liberal to allow it to
Yeah,
exist. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
just
The
like,
Jew- the Jewish national identity and the Palestinian national identity would both have to be embedded within a broader, more fundamental national identity
yeah,
that both groups identify with more than the smaller groups.
yeah. What would that potentially be, like gay space communism?
It would look like South Carolina and New York City agreeing to be part of the same union,
Yeah,
e pluribus unum, or however you
yeah,
pronounce it.
yeah. To back to Cooper. I have a fondness for him. I don't know why. I can't explain it. And I don't think it's because he's just necessarily woke right or trying to destroy national narratives. He's just a brilliant storyteller.
Yeah,
And he goes so far with his work that it's really difficult to counter him. You can counter him on any given statement and take issue with that, but his arc, his ability to build such human arcs and reflect this back to each other is just beyond the pale. So I have a lot of admiration for him, but I invite the critique. And if we can go back to your critique of the framework that he used with regard to Palestine, what's the alternative framework to Palestine? And this might be a little bit alternative history or speculative fiction,
Mhm.
but how can you give the Palestinians the legitimacy that they need to live their lives? in
I
harmony with Israel,
yeah,
if that's even possible.
yeah. I think that through a variety of circumstances we could talk about further, it might be possible to change their ideology, to change the historiography that they adhere to. There are key assumptions behind Palestinian historiography that Daryl Cooper adopts and propagates in his work. And I could, take these on piece by piece if we want to go on for hours. I already talked about a couple of them.
Yeah, yeah,
But the fundamental assumptions are number one, Jews and Muslims lived together in peace before Zionists began to arrive in Palestine. Number two, the incoming Zionists were colonial invaders with no connection to their presumed homeland. Three, Palestinian Arabs were nationally differentiated from the Arabs of the surrounding region. So the Arabs of Palestine were, in some fundamental sense, distinct as a political unit from the Arabs of Syria, Lebanon, the Arabs of Transjordan, and the Arabs of Egypt.
yeah.
Four, the Palestinians were the unwitting victims of British and Zionist machinations, justifiably defending themselves from colonial imposition by alien forces. Their actions,
You
in
you
short,
don't you don't agree with that. Why don't you agree with that? If you're living somewhere and you're displaced or threatened by another force, wouldn't you defend yourself?
the thing is, the quote unquote displacement happened through the application of property rights, the use of the same rights, the same rules that everybody was playing by. I mean, going back to the analogy you used earlier, and in fact, Daryl Cooper used the same analogy of living in a house and then somebody comes inside and starts taking over the house. The actual proper analogy would be this. You're renting a house from somebody else. That somebody else is the Ottoman Empire.
Hmm.
Um, Somebody else, and then a third part, the Jews, they start, renting a house, or sorry, renting out a different part of the house that is owned by
Yeah.
the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire goes away and is replaced. The deeds, the property deeds are now owned by the British Empire. Um, and more Jews start doing more and more business. Maybe other people who are renting the apartment, the Jews do business with them,
Yeah.
the person leaves. Or alternatively, they make a deal with the British person who owns the house, and they're allowed to move into empty rooms.
Yeah.
Uh, or maybe there's you living in your room, and as part of your rental agreement, there's the agreement that you made with the previous, I don't know, maybe the friend of
Yeah,
the
you're
previous
subletting.
owner.
Yeah.
Yeah. You made a friend with the previous owner, right? They're subleasing it to you, and they made a deal with the Jews who are moving in, and they're like, okay, now the Jews are going to live here because they bought the lease, right? This is fundamentally what ended up happening. Nobody was illegally forced from their property prior to 1948. After 1948, with the Nakba, with the war that the Palestinian side started, it's a different set of circumstances, so a different set of rules apply.
Just
But
briefly, why would the Palestinians do that?
why they would start the war?
Yeah. Was
Um,
it outside interference or something else? Just
there,
briefly. Sorry.
Daryl Cooper tells the Palestinian side of the story for that. But basically, what ended up happening was from the 1880s, he starts the clock at 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, which is what the Palestinian side always does. In reality, it started much earlier in the 1880s. Um, Escalating tensions between the Jewish side and the Arab side, which consisted mostly of Muslims, but a minority of Christians. Um, and some of them actually did end up fighting on the Jewish side, which is why you ended up with 2 million Arabs inside of Israel after the war. But putting that off to the side,
Hmm.
whatchamacallit, yeah, they ended up becoming Israelis. But but putting that off to the side, you have very dark and very bloody reprisals and counter reprisals that are happening over the course of these decades. And the British is fucking everything up and pissing off both sides all along until at
Thanks,
last.
British. So you are aligned with the Churchillian skepticism.
No, yeah, no,
A bit.
Churchill is not a hero of this story from either the Zionist side or the Palestinian side, even though from the Palestinian point of view, the British were acting as Zionist lapdogs.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, from the Zionist point of view, the British were being assholes who, if not for their actions, the Holocaust might not even have happened because right before the Holocaust took effect, they issued something called the White Paper Declaration of 1939, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to the land just when they need access to it the most.
Okay, so that is a huge, like, one of Cooper's, like, he's just getting slammed by people who haven't, like, listened to his work, and calling him a Hitler apologist and a Holocaust denier, and he's neither of those. Do you agree he's neither of those things? And the critique that you're giving does align with them. I don't know why I'm going to bat for the guy, but it's just
At,
really interesting to see how
So it sounds
he's
like
being
he
met.
recorded this in 2015. I'm hedging here because I don't know any of his activities in the time since.
Okay, all right,
What I know of him, I know only from this 2015
okay,
recordings.
sweet,
From these
okay.
recordings, I have no evidence that he has anything but mainstream uh, understanding of the Holocaust.
And from your point of view, what do you mean by mainstream? Is that different than
I,
the way
I
that you
mean, I
see
mean,
it?
I mean, he accepts the view that the Holocaust was a systematic program enacted by the Nazis. It was not an accident. It was not decentralized. It was something that they were consciously doing on purpose, and it resulted in a death count for Jews that is closer to 6 million than to say 100,000, which is what the
Okay.
so-called quote unquote revisionists would say.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Revisionist. That's another weird word.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We got way off track and I forgot where we were going with this.
Yeah, we were talking about Palestinians as unwitting victims of British and Zionist machinations,
Yeah.
justifiably defending themselves from colonial imposition by alien forces.
Yeah.
But we eventually got to the part where the British issued a declaration that, might have prevented the Holocaust had they not issued it. And as you can imagine, the Jews went completely berserk when they realized the full scale of the Holocaust and the amount of bloodshed that had happened. This was seen as a betrayal by the British, and the Jews formed even more extreme terrorist organizations than they'd already had, and just started doing everything they can to kick the British out.
Hmm.
And eventually, this disrupts this idea. This fact, among a zillion others, disrupts the idea that the Jews were just wards of British colonizers. It's not true. Um, it's like saying the Jews participated in Ottoman imperialism because they did business with the Ottomans to try to
Hmm.
acquire more land as well. It doesn't make sense. They were just doing business with whoever was in charge, and the Arabs were also doing business with whoever was in charge, be it the
Yeah.
Ottomans or the British.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But
yeah,
oh, go
go
ahead.
on. No, well, how do we interpret this history in a way, I mean, from my point of view, why is it so important? And you brought up that the erosion of Israel's legitimacy will lead to the erosion of American legitimacy. And in my mind, as you're telling these stories, I'm imagining, in America, the liberal, the leftists have taken up giving these really weird speeches in the beginning of every meeting where
Yeah,
we are on the
yeah,
unceded land of X and X tribe. And I'm
yeah.
just imagining these like the Iroquois or whatever, like just kind of we own this land and kind of showing up in force and like supplanting the wasps or whatever it would be, and how impossible that even is as a thought experiment. But it is kind of the justification for Israel is that they were forced off their land and then they got enough resources to come back to their land, to claim their land and organize it as they see fit.
But keep in mind this, though. Keep in mind this fact. There was no state. It was functionally a no man's land. So
Mm,
there was private property and there were private property owners, but public property, state institutions, a centralized monetary system, a department of finances, a ministry
yeah.
of transportation, things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
None of that existed. It was developed there by the Jews.
I'm sure there were roads and money
Well,
was used
in
to
a lot
some
of
sort of
in a lot of
standard.
places there were no roads. Like you
Okay.
could look at old photos of Jews beginning to settle the lands. It's just empty sand dunes. Like
Yeah.
look up Tel Aviv founding and then
Yeah.
compare what it looks like in that photo to what it looks like today.
Yeah.
It's not even close.
Yeah. And I'm trying to, what's your, like, if you give Palestinians the biggest benefit of the doubt while not accepting untruths or narratives that you object to, like, what is their position and their role? If they are just performing economically much poorer than the Jews, then there's going to be like a two-tiered system. Like the Jews have to work, like that equality is going to cause a lot of tension. The inequality is going to cause a lot of tension. The inequality of strength and then of story, and
It
are there
goes further
success
than that.
stories?
It goes further than that. If they had full political equality with the Jews, they would still be dissatisfied because they want the Jews to be zimi.
They want resources from the Jews.
They want
Reparations?
no, they want zimi status. They want the Islamically prescribed status, especially in the Holy Land,
Yeah.
where Jews are
Okay.
second-class citizens.
Okay.
There are theological reasons for this.
Yeah.
Both in the Christian variant of anti-Semitism in medieval times and in the Islamic variant. And it comes down to the fact that the Jews were the religion first, and these other religions were offshoots. And if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim and you see that the Jews, the people who have rejected your message, the original version of the religion that you subscribe to, are doing well, especially in their most holy place in the world, there's an insecurity of identity that results from that, or at least did result from that in medieval times with Christians and continues to be the case with Muslims to this day. And it makes you wonder, is my religion just a knockoff? Did the Jews have it right all the time? So the Jews have to be kept in a wretched state for theological purposes because it supports the view that God is punishing them for refusing to accept the truth of Muhammad or the truth of Jesus or whoever it is. And if the Jews are doing well, then this must mean that they've somehow cheated their way out of God's divine justice.
Yeah.
And this was kind of the basis of traditional pre-modern anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the logic behind it.
That's the other question. Like what's an acceptable amount of anti-Semitism? And if it's zero, how do you get there? And let's just talk in the right or in America. It seems to be, I don't think it was ever going away, but it's more visible now, now that the censors have left off. Like how much are we able to tolerate intolerance, or how much intolerance are you willing to tolerate in order to get what you want?
Well, we have to first understand, what differentiates modern anti-Semitism from pre-modern anti-Semitism. And it all comes down again to the question of national identity. With the Enlightenment and with the change of Jewish identity from one that is bound up in religion to one that is separable into a purely national component, it became possible for some people to say that Jews are members of an alien nation, the purpose of which is the extraction of wealth and the manipulation of all other nations to serve the purposes of this nation, the Jewish nation, be they of a Bolshevist character or of a Zionist character. The Jewish tentacles are siphoning away everything from all the other nations of the world, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the left-wing version of this, which is the Jewish national identity is a false construction. The Jewish identity is purely religious in character. It's any claims to it being a national identity is just the result of false consciousness for the purposes of justifying colonialism and
Extraction of wealth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is where the horseshoe gets back.
yeah, and bewitching Jews, right? They'll hedge that. They'll try to differentiate themselves from Nazis. They'll say like the real Jews are the ones who reject the national identity. They'll say they'll say that the national identity distracts Jews from the fact that they're part of the working class and that all the workers of the world should unite.
Yeah. Which is odd. Oh, segue. I'm so sorry. Another segue. How did it be the case that a lot of the founding European migrants to Israel, the Jewish migrants, were Bolshevik, and now how did that shake out? How did the left-wingism shake out when met with that particular reality?
So this is actually another area where Daryl Cooper does pretty well in disambiguating the various strands of leftism. He distinguishes Bolshevist Jews who repudiated their national identity from Zionist Jews who leaned into it. And
Mm.
these two groups hated each other. They didn't get along. In fact, he tells a story about how Menachem Begin, one of the guys who would go on to become a prime minister of Israel, he was taken in for questioning by the NKVD, and one of the guys interrogating him was a Bolshevist, quote unquote Jew. I say quote unquote Jew because I don't recognize communists as Jews. I think that the national identity is a
Whoa.
necessary. I think the national identity is a necessary
Okay.
prerequisite. And if you repudiate national identity, then it doesn't make sense to call you
What
a
are you
Jew.
left with then? What is a
You
Jew without a national identity?
a communist.
Okay. Which nullifies their Jewishness. So I guess the only thing that marks them as a Jew is that they are descendant from Jews.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have Jewish parents or whatever. Maybe even they observe a holiday or something or some tradition. It doesn't matter if they don't
Mm,
identify with the nation. Now, doesn't mean they necessarily have to identify with the state, but the understanding of the Jew as a member of a nation
yeah.
specifically. And if
Okay.
you're in the business of eradicating nations, then it doesn't make sense to me that you could be a Jew.
Okay. Yeah. But similarly, it's the case that you can be a Jewish American. You can
Yeah,
love America and love Israel.
not Israel
And
necessarily, but Jews. You can identify with the Jewish nation and the history and culture and symbols associated with that. You can have solidarity with that and also solidarity with America.
okay. And those don't necessarily come in. I mean, I could see the case that I don't know. Jews are very competent people, so they end up at the top, and so a lot of the low-grade anti-Semitism is noticing like the Mayorkas or whatever is the architect of flooding our country with migrants from other third world countries. And you're like, why would a Jew do that?
Well, it depends on the type of Jew we're talking about. Are we talking about an actual Jew, one who loves the nation, or are we talking about a communist who leverages his Jewish heritage, his parents' history as Jews, maybe even maybe all he knows about Jewish identity, or all he cares about Jewish identity, is his ability to whack people over the head with the Holocaust, to wield
Hmm.
it as a weapon to get whatever he wants.
Yeah. I wonder if there's I really want to be a peacemaker, and I know it's not my problem or position, but there is a lot of anti-Semitism, at least symbolically, in the alternative or e-right sphere, and it seems like the e-right has a lot of really beneficial based ideas, but like it's mired in this anti-Semitism. And I've seen you do overtures of saying that this is how do you separate and decrease that, or say that it's just not beneficial to any party to
Yeah.
participate in that.
So, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about tolerance, its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The greatest strength is that allows for interesting creative energy to enter the scene,
Yeah.
and you can marshal that to your advantage. People can start exploring new and interesting ideas. And then the greatest weakness is that it also allows in shit, and that shit can get popular for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality.
Mm. Hmm.
Some people's palates become palatable towards shit sometimes.
Mm. And the process of swerving people's taste buds away from shit involves what?
It involves, well, I'm biased, so I think it would involve taking on a project that I've talked about in previous discussions with you, which is a more robust epistemology of
Mm.
adhering to criteria, objective criteria that allow us to more accurately navigate the world.
Hmm. And how is that going? Oh, well, how can we use our discussion today to showcase that? Like how have we approached these questions in a way that exhibits
Well,
the integrity that you desire?
we've talked about Jews. We've raised some difficult questions about Jews, questions that might make some people uncomfortable because they're not sure if they might be stepping on a landmine. And we've shown that there are responsible and interesting ways to tackle these conversations. Um, I think that, especially what I talked about earlier with the fact that there's a plurality of historiographies, and you kind of have to choose between them. People have to understand that the world is not divided into the mainstream I support the current thing narrative, and the counter narrative, the negation, where you define yourself entirely by your negation
Yeah.
to the quote unquote mainstream narrative. And
Yeah.
maybe if you negate hard enough, maybe if you chase after chase the rabbit, as they like to say,
Mm.
down to find the Jew at the bottom of the rabbit hole, you haven't actually gone towards truth. It's like I've used this analogy in a different context. It's like you're departing from a port, right? And you want to get away from land, but you don't have a destination set. So you just get as far away as possible, and you end up getting lost in the ocean because you haven't charted a course.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where I think the anti-Semitism on the right principally comes from. It's also probably mixed in with frustration and easy narratives that have been in development for a long time, and that it's easy to pick up and continue projecting the world onto.
And what about criticism of American Jews? Like, are they like
Uh,
messing up the messaging in certain ways that it
I,
makes your job more difficult?
I mean, my job is made difficult by the existence of the kind of quote unquote Jew who you had on the other day, uh, who I see as someone who leverages his Jewish heritage for the purpose of advancing a decidedly non-Jewish internationalist agenda. And is not unique in that respect. There are a lot of people who will leverage identity. There'll be people you see this all the time, like on Twitter. I am a devout Christian who believes that there should be open borders because it's supported by my theology, right? I believe my religion tells me that Jesus wants you to be a cuck. Jesus says open your door and let whoever fuck your wife or whatever.
Yeah,
This is
turn
this
the
is
other ass cheek. Go
Yeah,
to a Diddy
exactly.
party. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's leveraging an identity that's difficult to attack for the purpose of promoting cuckoldry.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to be able to call this out. We have to be able to distinguish between people who are sincere in their adoption and their discussion of a particular identity and the role that that plays in informing their understanding of the world versus people who use it as a weapon just to beat people over the head with. I remember a story that I heard on a was it a podcast or was it a proper video? I don't remember, but Dave, the distributist
Yeah.
who I've argued with about these topics, there was a video he made about a coworker he'd had, an Indian woman, who who was extremely annoying because on the surface it didn't appear that she had any solidarity, any affiliation to her heritage. She never talked about how much she loved the Vedic scriptures or about cultural figures or the traditional dress or anything like that. She only ever brought up her identity for the purpose of talking about how much she hated white men. That's not an identity. That's a weapon.
Yeah, well, I guess in the absence of a positive ethnicity for the non-Jewish white male, you're going to have againstness as the defining, you're going to have contrarianism as a defining characteristic of that. And I don't know how you get away from that. But
If
with
you're going to
that
be woke,
ethnicity being the one that you're being whipped about, then the trap is that you counter that,
if
public
you're going to
humiliation.
Yeah, if you're going to be woke and you're going to engage in the business of telling, white people, for example, that the entirety of their identity is rooted in the history of oppression of, I don't know, other people, say black people, for example, since that's the big one in America, then, as a critical race theorist or as somebody who benefits in some way, maybe you're working for an NGO, or maybe you're part of a news organization and the only thing you know how to write about is race because that's all you've ever written about. It's going to be great news for you when the backlash inevitably comes and people start carrying, tiki torches and shouting the Jews will not replace us because, that means more money for you. More conflict means more money for you, and you can
Yeah.
profit off of this conflict.
Yeah.
So
But
I think a broader, more widespread recognition of the games that are played with identity, and distinguishing between sincere applications of inter ethnic conflict, actual serious discussions versus bullshit, would be a good step in the right direction.
so you're not against identity. Identity is a part of how the world operates, functions to you in a positive way. Like the ethnic identity of Jews as a nation functions as a container for liberal ideals and a good life, I guess you would say. But you're not against people having an identity. You're against the weaponization of identity and the false application of identity. And
Hmm.
if that's the case, then how does America retain its identity? Where is the lodestar that founds us so that there is a positive move that we can work against the state and for our nation? Because the state, obviously, and maybe this is controversial or maybe it's not, doesn't seem to be in the interest of the nation at this point in history.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the big question. I think, I expect that if the American national identity is going to have a future, then it needs to be revived. How exactly you go about that, I would search history for the answers. I would search philosophy for the answers. But
What's your gut tell you
I don't
intuitively?
I don't look to the future on these questions. I only look to the past and to history and to philosophy, and I leave it to people of a more activist orientation
To do the work.
to propose
Yeah.
the solutions.
But what makes you feel most American? Let me put it that way, because I know it has to speak to you. So what speaks to you?
Mostly the holidays because they connect the present to the past.
So a tradition.
Yeah.
In the height of 2020, when the atrocities of our freaking death cult of a state were at its peak, Bloomberg of all news, that Bloomberg spent that whole weekend denigrating America, just shitting all over America. It was just the most vilest thing. We were all
Hmm.
like subjected to just psychological warfare and with the lockdowns and all that stuff. And then they
Right.
go against America. It was just like there's traitors in our midst, but they
They
think that
want to
they're
dissolve your
virtuous.
national identity so that you
Yeah.
join the revolution.
Well, fuck that. Revolution for what?
uh, so that you can meet the new boss, same as the old boss,
Yeah. Right.
only not bound by constitutional limitations.
So I guess you don't want to talk about the future, but what portends for Israel, this conflict? What do you hope? How does this current conflict resolve in your mind? Is
It
it
re
scorched earth?
it resolves in a decidedly illiberal manner. It resolves the same way the conflict with Nazi Germany was resolved, through first the application of overwhelming force, and second, brainwashing people into a national identity that is actually compatible with the modern world.
I cheer your honesty. Do you think that that's a bad thing or just a real thing?
I think that I love what liberalism allows, which is the propagation of interesting and new ideas that could potentially, improve people's lives. It's the freedom to be able to think that's most valuable to me in liberalism.
Hmm.
And but liberalism can only exist under conditions where those who would challenge it are subjugated through the overwhelming application of force.
Yeah,
And
subjugated to it. You can disagree with it, but you can't. You have to operate according to its rules.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
No.
And for that reason, Islamism cannot exist on the same planet, or at the very least, it would have to be quarantined.
Hmm.
In the
Uh.
case in the
Wow.
case of Gaza, the way I see this shaking out, ideally, assuming people still have balls, is the overwhelming the complete eradication of Hamas's command structure. So you can look up. I think I linked it to you, but you can look up Hamas's most wanted. It's a deck of cards with faces and a bunch of red X's on them.
Hmm.
So all of those X's have to be red. All of the hostages, dead or alive, have to be returned home. And when Gaza is rebuilt, UNRWA and other agencies that are responsible for propagating jihadist, uh, jihadist and anti-Semitic ideology, they can't be part of the process. You'll have to brainwash them into a completely new national identity. It doesn't have to be pernicious in the way woke people are trying to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to get them to, hate who they are and join the
Mm-hmm.
working class revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be a national identity that's rooted in historical fact and one that is characterized by its ascent to liberal principles, to liberal presuppositions.
Hmm. Yeah, liberals with big balls would be pretty cool to see. But I think the reality is that half measures, I don't know, maybe half measures won't be taken. Or if there's conciliatory pathway. I guess that
I
would involve voluntary submission and return of those hostages and submission to.
you have to really understand the culture of Gaza, of Palestinians generally, but of Gazans especially, to be able to see why a conciliatory pathway, why basically no pathway other than the overwhelming application of force followed by brainwashing is basically the only way out of this mess for that region. You have kids who are basically raised in kindergartens where you can watch videos of this. This is not like Mossad propaganda. Like there's this is coming out on Hamas Telegram channels where the kid the kids have AK-47s. Like there's a kindergarten ceremony of kids marching around with AK-47s and putting on a show for their parents of them defeating an Israeli soldier and taking him hostage. There are kids shows. Look up Hamas kids shows. Look up. You know what everybody should do after they're done watching this? Look up Farfour the jihadi mouse.
Farfour.
Farfour the jihadi mouse. You have to get a sense of the culture on the ground. You're not dealing with rational actors. You're dealing with people who are deeply embedded within a completely brainwashed society that where people are raised from the cradle to the grave to believe that the greatest joy in life comes from being a martyr against Jews.
Hmm.
I know that sounds like dehumanizing propaganda, and like I get it. You hear something like this, your mind turns to like World War II posters of Japanese people who look like animals. We have video. We know what they do. We know how they teach their children, and we know the role that organizations like UNRWA play in perpetuating these ideologies. It has to be a full-blown systematic denazification program
Yeah.
because otherwise this is going to go nowhere.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I really appreciate your candor, and it's going to get a lot of people's ears burning and heads shaking. And I'm looking forward to the comment section
Absolutely.
on this. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this with candor. The thing that drives me crazy is that people telling me not to talk about these things or like belittling me for asking questions, and it's just like, no, there's got to be a way forward. There's got to be a way.
Just use your
So
brain.
yeah. Well, I mean, I wanted to use yours, so thank you for
Yeah, absolutely.
renting it out to me. Where can people find you, and what are they going to find when they get there?
They're going to find a YouTube channel that hardly ever uploads for the past few
Wait,
years,
you don't have a
but
Substack? You haven't joined the Substack,
I have a
Romana?
Substack, but
Yeah.
I haven't gotten around to write anything because I'm such a perfectionist. I put
Mm,
one sentence down and I already hate it.
yeah.
Um, but you can find my YouTube channel, get King Crocoduck. I'm sure Ben will link it,
Yeah.
and I have a Twitter as well. Not as interesting. I just mostly rant and post memes.
Yeah. No, it's spicy. It's good. It's what you need to do as a young boy, not yet 30.
Uh-huh.
Gotta waste your energy somehow. Well, I'm gonna wrap up the recording. Anything else that you feel we didn't cover or covered incompletely?
Um, Let me think. I think maybe just to wrap it up with a bow, you don't need to ask other people's permission to use your brain, so long as you actually put some effort into using it.
Hmm. Well, I hope I satisfied you with my questions.
You will
King
always
Crocoduck.
satisfy me, Ben.
Well, thank you. It's good. It's nice to be likable. And I like you too. I'm going to wrap up the recording now.